Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and authors that I've been interviewing. And today I interview a young lady by the name of Allison Alsup, who's written a wonderful historical novel called Foreign Seed. Now, this is a great book set back in 1918, and it deals with the actual true life mystery of the disappearance of a botanist named Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer was over in China trying to find new seeds to overcome blights and things in America, and he went missing. And lo and behold, there's a vice consul named Samuel Sokoban. And this is Sokoban's attempt to find out what happened to Meyer on this trip. This is got great historical detail. It's a wonderful fictional book, though, and which touches on so many different aspects. And I think you're gonna really like it. And all this stuff. So, well, where do these people get their information from? Well, she got it from photographs with Meyer and his letters. He got stuff from the Department of Agriculture, National Archives. That's where she found stuff about Sokoban, and she was able to blend this. Not only that, this was her second attempt at the book. Yeah, this is how hard it is to be an author. She sat there almost for a decade. She had one manuscript done completely and had to scratch it, start all over again. This is a wonderful book about this story about a gentleman going up the Yangtze River to find out what happened to Frank Meyer, who, by the way, if you are like us, if you like food, the Meyer lemon is named after Frank Meyer. So, a little bit of information there, trivia. But anyway, this is a great book. I hope you're going to enjoy it. And I want to take us right now to our interview with Allison Alsup. Welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you, Blaine. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, again, Allison is the author of this really wonderful book called Foreign Seed. Uh, it's really well done, and that's the first I want to ask you is where'd that cover come from?
Well, ultimately, the publisher has control over that. But in this case, Turner was incredibly wonderful to work with, very responsive. We wanted something that felt part and parcel. It's, of course, what you hope to convey on a cover of a book so that the story actually begins as soon as as a reader, a potential reader picks up the copy. I'm so happy with the way that it turned out. The river that is pictured there is indeed the Yangtze, which is the setting of this novel. The boat is a sampan, traditional riverboat of the time, so it feels very authentic.
Good. Well, like I said, I really enjoyed this book, and but before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about you, your background, where you're from, and I think you were even a teacher, a professor, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a circuitous route to publish this, although writing has been a mainstay of my life in one way or another for quite some time. I'm originally from California, but I am now a New Orleanian. I've lived here for almost a quarter of a century, so longer as an adult than any other place in my life. And I did used to teach. I used to teach at the University of New Orleans, and I taught the dreaded composition classes and survey lit classes that every student loves to tell you how much they hate. I did that for quite some time. And eventually I hit a point where I felt my own writing was perhaps in peril from all of the grading and so forth. So I left. And what then became quite a few years of working on my own writing, and since then, I have also co founded a small nonprofit here that teaches creative writing classes, but is not affiliated with any university. This is just private adult interest classes called New Orleans Writers Workshop. So I teach through them, but I also do developmental editing, working one on one with writers on their own projects. Usually it's novels. And I'm really grateful for that symbiotic relationship. Working on other people's manuscripts has absolutely made me into a stronger writer. And there were many times when I was working on Foreign Seed, either in the original drafts or in the revision process, where I thought, Allison, what would you do when I came to a tough kind of moment and I had to make a choice? What would you tell your class? What would you tell a client? Imagine now you took your own advice.
Mhm. Good. Now, did you get a degree in English when you were in college?
I have a degree in French literature, undergrad, and then I have an MFA from Emerson College in fiction.
Okay, wow. And now, then this book is part historical. We'll get into that. But were you history? Was that something that interested you growing up?
Well, I hope history interests everyone. I certainly grew up with two parents who were interested in that, so perhaps it filtered down. But other times, other places, I think they've always held a fascination for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Well, now then that gets me to this. Well, now you're full time writing. Other than doing a bit at the Writing Institute, you basically are a full time author right now.
I wish that were true. I would just say is that anyone who comes out with a novel for a certain time, you are doing a side gig, which is the novel. That is its own work.
Mhm.
Sometimes writers may think earlier on, before they publish a book, that the hardest part is writing the manuscript. That may or may not be true.
Mhm.
There is a whole world that comes after you publish it. But I would say that more than just a little bit, I work with New Orleans Writers Workshop. So I teach there several times a year. I'm about to go and do an intensive in Martha's Vineyard. And then I have multiple clients that I work with routinely.
Oh, wow. Now, and I asked this of many of my the clients, or they volunteer. Is this the first book you wrote? Or are there any down there in the bottom shelf that have not seen the light of day yet?
Well, there was an entire manuscript of this novel, and it didn't work. So the
Oh,
novel that was produced was a complete rewrite, a complete rewrite. Originally, I had a very different focus, one that really attempted to focus on Meyer's third expedition in China.
okay.
And ultimately, that manuscript suffered. The agent didn't take it. So I had to begin from page one. And it was kind of an epiphany moment. I wish that it had come from my own brain. But it was more like I was watching Netflix, watching probably the 800th murder mystery series. I love British murder mysteries. And a light bulb went off. And I said, Allison, this novel that you have been attempting to write is not the expedition of Meyer. It's when he goes missing. He is missing. And within 5 minutes, the version of this novel that ultimately saw the light of day, it started to formulate in my mind. If Meyer was not ultimately the protagonist who was, and it would be our detective like figure, Vice Counsel Samuel Sokoban.
Wow. That's something. By the way, if you ever get bored with British murder mysteries, let me recommend South Korean drama series. My wife and
Okay.
I are hooked on South Korean drama series. We love those things.
Well, at a
But
certain point, there may not be anybody left in Britain because there's so many mysteries that come out. It's a new
you're
person
right.
killed every moment.
It seems like it. Well, now, again, what was that inspiration then behind writing Foreign Seed? How did you get to Frank Meyer? How did you get to everybody? Well, because we'll get to the characters in a minute, but what was that inspiration?
Yeah, it was, I think this happens to a lot of writers. It's just happenstance, it's chance. And so I was doing some research for a different set of material. It was different stories having to do with Chinese American immigrants. And through that, I came across some photographs of rural Chinese countryside that had been taken at the turn of the century, 20th century. And they were all attributed to Frank Meyer. I said, who is this guy? What was he doing in rural China at this time? I went down the internet rabbit hole. And before I knew it, I had come across Frank Meyer and then pieced it together that this is the Frank Meyer who brought us the Meyer lemon. Meyer lemons are really the only kind of lemons that are grown down here in Louisiana. I have one outside my window in my backyard. So this became very interesting to me. At first, that was the inspiration was Meyer himself. And the fact that this was even a job to be a botanical explorer, to work for the American government, that there was a small team of guys who went to foreign countries, risked their life for the hope of bringing back plants that would be useful for cultivation on US soil. And that was indeed his job, which was through the agriculture department. And the book is called Foreign Seed because that's the office that Meyer worked for. It was a small outfit in the Department of Agriculture, the Office of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction.
Wow. Well, that's a fascinating, how you found that and everything. What, what did you when you sat down and you started with one excuse me, you sat down, you started with this one expedition, you switched to another. But did you have a theme in mind when you got started with this whole book? What were you looking for on this whole thing? Was it a mystery? Was it a human insight? What were you looking for?
It's a great question, Blaine, because I think ultimately the novel reflects both of those. And as a writer, ultimately you have to make a choice. Was this going to be a mystery first and foremost? Meyer goes missing, right? And Vice Counsel Samuel Sokovin is sent upriver to find out what's happened to this missing explorer, who Meyer was at that point an Americanized citizen. Or was this going to be a literary story, right, that happened to contain a mystery? And those books live in different places in the bookstore. Those books have different labels, right? So some of this is determined ultimately by the fact that the book will become a product to be sold. If I had my druthers, there would be no need to make such choices, but I understood that I would. My training and my experience is more with literary fiction, despite what I watch on the sofa. So I knew that I wanted to have a strong mystery element, but I felt as though I was really drawn to characterization. I wanted to be able to really play with language and lush details. And so I fell a little to the side of literary fiction. But I hope that that mystery continues to punctuate and drive forward that plot.
Mhm.
So
Well, now,
absolutely, the mystery was important. And in terms of your question of, what was I after? The mystery itself, the investigation into the search for Meyer offered me from the get-go a I would say, kind of stepping stones for the plot itself. Because the book is based on the original report that was filed by the actual Samuel Sokovin at the time. Okay, so in 1918, he wrote up a report, which is something like 7.5, 8 double spaced pages. It survives in the National Archives. And so those events of the investigation I stayed true to. Of course, 7.5, 8 pages is not going to sustain a novel. So a lot of material had to be dramatized, added in, but at least I began with that skeleton of events.
okay. Well, now, Myers is one of a historical figure, obviously. And for those people who are not familiar with Frank Meyer, and we do have the Meyer lemon because of him, tell us a little bit about Frank Meyer. How many trips did he make up to China? Did he really have around 1,000 pounds of pear seeds with him when he on his return trip?
He really did. At that time, the problem that he was working on, and sometimes these botanical explorers, they were called agricultural explorers, were sent over to try and rectify a particular problem. So at that time, there was a pear blight. They were looking for seeds that would be very resistant or had shown themselves to be resistant. And these were Chinese wild pears. They were totally inedible, but if they were hybridized in or grafted in, they provided inoculation against pests. So that's really what he was in search of. And it focused his expedition far more than he wanted to. But he was an incredibly interesting guy, iconoclast of his time. He was born in Amsterdam, working class family, and knew from a very young age, something like 12, that he wanted to travel the world and study plants. At that time, being from modest roots, he might as well have said he wanted to be an astronaut because, right, because at that time in Holland, you needed to have quite a bit of money to go to university. His parents quickly said, no, this is not going to happen. But Meyer rebelled in his own way until he got an apprenticeship at the Amsterdam Botanical Garden. And there he came under the apprenticeship of Professor De Vries, who was a forerunner in plant genetics, took Frank Meyer, then just a teenager, under his wing, brought him up, allowed him to go to lectures free of charge, paid for a university for Frank Meyer to go. And it's because of that apprenticeship under what was at the time a famous university professor that Meyer was allowed to excel in plants and learn so much. By 18, he was running the experimental garden at the Amsterdam Botanical Society. But that desire to travel, that wanderlust that exhibited itself from a very young age with him. He was the kind of kid who walked after school. When he went to university, he walked the 80 miles from university back home. He would he was just a chronic, persistent walker. And then he decided Holland was too small and he needed to fulfill his dreams. And so he began years of travel, eventually settling in the United States. But that desire, even so, to continue to explore remained. And so when he got his dream job, the one that he said at 12 years old he wanted, and that seemed totally beyond the realm of possibility, that was with the Office of Foreign Seed and Plant Introduction. And he set sail for China for the first time, having no knowledge of Chinese language, customs, ever having been there, having no idea what he would meet with, right? For the first time in the fall of 1906. And he would do a total of 4 expeditions, completely rigorous. And it is not an exaggeration to say that with each expedition, he absolutely risked his life. He was often the first white person that those villages ever saw. And so he would go out with a small band of men, porters. Sometimes they were carrying the material themselves. Sometimes there would be pack animals over steep mountains, snowy fields. At one point, meeting with bandits. Meyer probably killed someone in self defense after having been attacked. He could have perished in any number of ways: accidents, disease, attack, malnutrition, freezing to death, you name it. But it was who he was at his core. And eventually, what became clear to me as I studied him was that the wanderlust and the drive and the discipline that I so admired, probably because I wish for some of it for myself, was ultimately not a choice with Meyer. It became a compulsion. And that, I think, comes out in this book where we see him or come to know about him on his 4th expedition.
Wow. Well, that tells us a little bit about Frank Meyer, who's lost at the beginning, and that brings us to Samuel Jacobin. Now, Samuel Jacobin, another historical figure, obviously not nearly as well known to me
No.
as Meyer, but who is Samuel Jacobin, and what? Well, just give us a little bit about his backstory.
Well, honestly, I didn't know very much about Samuel Jacobin. I knew of Samuel Jacobin because of his report, and that is what I knew. The real Samuel Jacobin would have been much younger during the investigation. He would have still been in his 20s, which I felt would be hard for a modern reader to buy. And I also wanted him to be a little bit further along in life in terms of his experience. So I chose to make him older. It was a tough call because I think with every historical fiction writer has to make a balance between wanting to remain true to certain facts, but then also wanting to give yourself leeway in order to create the best story. I felt that with Meyer, because he was a more public figure, because there is information about him that is more readily available, that it was to the best interest of the story to remain true to the facts as I could. So, in terms of the investigation, to the degree that I could, with very little change, and I mean very little change, the facts in the book are following the original investigation. I let that lead that plot. And then in terms of Meyer's background, his biography, everything that I say is true. So that's either taken from letters or from biography or photographs. I really tried to stay true to the angle of Meyer. But with Sakobin, I felt it was really important to give myself latitude. So other than the facts of his investigation, really everything about Samuel Sakobin, other than the fact that he's an American vice consul, right? And that he was stationed in Nanking, is fabricated, 100% made up. So I've made up his family, I've made up his relationship to his faith, I made up his emotional stance, all of the things that factor in. And in hindsight, for better or worse, perhaps there are descendants of Sokoban's family who will, curse my name or get in touch with me. They haven't yet, but it was what was important was I needed right, not yet. What was important was that, he be given free rein to create an interesting book, because while this book begins or is prompted, inspired by the mystery of what's happened to Frank Meyer, ultimately, this book belongs to Samuel Sokoban.
Mhm. Yep, absolutely. Wonderful. Wonderful how you turned that around, and, I when I was reading about this, of course, I can't stop looking on the internet myself. I'm typing in, and I saw that, much of Sokoban's works are actually at the Hoover Institute up there in, Stanford, and I didn't know if you ever got a chance to delve into those things.
I did not, and I think it's good, at the time that I didn't realize that they existed. I did try to find internet, but, materials on him at the time, but that did not come to my attention, and I have to say that in retrospect, that is probably an happy oversight or mistake, because had that happened, had I gone and looked through those records, many of which would have been because Samuel Sokoban was so young during this investigation, after this time, I might have been too persuaded about the man that he became later, or I may have felt as though I needed to be beholden to the factuality of his life. And I'm not sure that it would have made for as strong a book. So those are my choices, and I stand by them.
Yeah, friends, and I forgot to mention this a little bit earlier, and there was the first manuscript, and there's this manuscript, there's research. Allison, from day one to when it got published, how many years? How long did it take for this whole thing to come to fruition?
Oh, 800 years, give or take. This is a place where it's so difficult, Blaine, to put a time on that, but I'm gonna say that at least a decade, and it's not the only thing that I worked on during that time. It was certainly not something that I worked on continuously, full-time, nothing like that. There were periods of time where I would be active, I would give up, have, my own anxious breakdown about it, and then and then push forward. So I think ultimately, when I found the manuscript it needed to be, that it took me several years to write the version that became this
And,
novel.
and that's important because there are people I know who listen to this who are avid readers who would try to write themselves. This is not a 6-month period. This doesn't happen
Oh, no.
overnight. And were persistent. And I think it's absolutely laudable that you had one manuscript and you realized, this isn't going to make it. I got to start all over. Oh my God, I
Yeah.
can't imagine how you wipe that from your brain and start all over again. That's just wonderful. Just did a wonderful job, Allison.
Well, I mean, there's that, there's insanity, like, I think historical fiction writers, there is a bit of a nutty side, Um, I mean, who would really logically ever queue themselves up to pursue such things, right? Especially something like this. I knew nothing about botanical exploration, nothing about plants, nothing about China, nothing about World War One, nothing about any of these things, including the Jewish faith, right, that enters into this book.
Mhm.
No reasonable person sets themselves up for this. But to your point, Blaine, it is really important for writers, especially working on their first manuscript, to understand that you are probably going to spend a disproportionate amount of time on this first manuscript. And when I look back on the first version, it was the version that taught me what I needed to know. It was the version that didn't work out so that I would be able to get to the version that would. Sometimes we write that book. It's
Yeah.
it's the manuscript that teaches us how to write a competent book. And if we stay with it, we get to that. The idea that you will publish or somehow just figure out how to write a novel in 6 months, well, maybe you will. Lucky you. But it's yeah, I don't want to know you. It's rather disgusting if you're that lucky. So most of us mere mortals, right? It's going to take a considerable more time.
Yeah. No doubt.
But I will also say this: I did not start over from ground zero, because even though it was page one, there was a lot of research, a lot of understanding of the story that was able to make it into, especially about Meyer, into the novel that got published.
No, good. Now, I know we'll get to one of the other fictitious characters, but one of the things I don't want to overlook here is that certain topics people don't write about anymore. And I think one of the main characters in this book is cigarettes. I really do. I mean, you start out almost in the first for couple pages. He Sokoban needs his cigarettes. What prompted you to bring that into the book? That was fantastic.
Chesterfield cigarettes.
Yeah.
So, part of the details, there are certain objects in this book that appear again and again and again. And I'll just say, from a writerly perspective, objects are a real friend. They are a great quiver in a writer's arrow, especially if you have objects that your characters interact with a lot. They can become litmus tests, they can become signals for how our character is feeling. Even if our character is not overtly saying that on the page, we come to understand. So, cigarettes here are both, I would say, triggering, but also the way that Sakobin is also trying to calm himself, soothe himself, however misguided. Chesterfield cigarettes were part and parcel of the time. They were smoked by soldiers in World War I because they were the first cigarette to have waterproof coating. So you can imagine, for soldiers in the trenches who faced very damp conditions, that having that waterproof packaging was a big deal. So once I found that detail, and also while I was doing research about flyers or the fighter pilots, the first war where we had fighter pilots, I should say here that an important part of this story is that Samuel Sokoban's younger brother is missing in action as a fighter pilot in World War I. And when I was doing that part of the research, the photographs that I came across almost always had the pilots with their scarves, their heavy leather jackets, their jumpsuits, and a cigarette in their hand. And so once I saw those photographs, I knew it had to be in the book. And as Samuel Sokoban is not only desperately searching for answers to what has happened to Frank Meyer, missing explorer, really the mystery of Sokoban's heart and soul is what's happened to his younger brother.
Mhm.
And so this object, a cigarette, which Sokoban did not smoke earlier on, becomes a way that he can connect and feel physically connected to his brother, and wanting to feel closer and trying to understand his brother.
Many would just use the typical alcohol. Okay, they became a drinker. They used to drinking their whiskey, their whatever they were going to drink. No, you use something completely different, yet it's completely true to form. That's wonderful. And yeah, that's. I don't even know if they make Chesterfield cigarettes anymore. I don't know.
I believe they do,
Do they? Okay.
and I'm waiting for Chesterfield, like Samuel Sokoban's family, to reach out to me. I feel like the book should have been sponsored by
Yeah,
them, or perhaps had a Surgeon General's warning on the cover. There's just a lot of cigarettes that are smoked.
there is. And like I said, it's a main character. It really
It is,
is. It's
it is.
wonderful. Really, absolutely wonderful. I'll tell you. Ay, 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 ay. So, anyway, we start studying Samuel Jacobin and his character and his loss and his searching, and it ties into Myers being gone. And eventually, he starts chugging up the Yangtze River. Not chugging up with the wind, but up he goes the Yangtze River to find whatever happened to Frank Meyer. Now, we know what happened to Frank Meyer in real life, but obviously,
Although
Jacobin
I
did not know
prefer
that.
not to go into it.
Right. We're not gonna do that. No, but he went up to try to find what happened. And who accompanies him but Mr. Lin. Now, Mr.
Yeah.
Lin, if I'm not mistaken, is a fictitious character. Did you pattern him after anyone?
Yeah, this is a great question, Blaine, because in the original report that was submitted by the actual Samuel Sokoban, he did go upriver with an interpreter, and the interpreter is never mentioned by name. But it is clear in the report, and I will not give away what this specific detail is, simply to say that the original, the actual interpreter, was the one who found the major breakthrough, the clue that the rest of the story really hinges on was from the interpreter. His name is lost to history. And so I felt it was really important not only to remain true to the facts of that Samuel Sokoban would have absolutely needed to have had an interpreter. China at that time was a place of not a universal Chinese language. In other words, you would have had so many dialects, and it would have been important to have someone from that region who was able to negotiate those. Sokoban would not have been able to do that on his own. But I
And that
also wanted to make this into a full-fledged character. It made me realize how important that interpreter would have been, how crucial he would have been to the investigation. And then if I pushed it forward in my mind, kind of developed it a little bit further, I thought these are very intense events. These are two men who are going to spend time close with one another under trying circumstances. And it just felt true that the interpreter needed to be more than just a functional interpreter, that he was a character in his own right, and that he would have absolutely contributed to how Sokoban would have felt, responded. He would have been a factor and a force in this story.
well, and that made me, as I read the book, Sokoban at the time in the book, and you've aged him a little bit, but in real life, you say he was
Yes.
younger. He was not really a people person. I mean, the way
No.
you have him, he was not cut out to be a vice counsel. He did shut the door all the time, didn't talk to people. That was fascinating that you did that. Did you find anything about that, or was that all creative imagination?
All creative imagination.
Wow.
When we recognize that we have to often have deeply flawed characters. If we don't, there is really not so much that is going to challenge them or hopefully overcome.
You
So
know what?
Sokoban has quite a few challenges going into this personally. And he part of the difficulty for him with this case is that he has been newly promoted to being a vice counsel. So he is not used to being, as they said in that day, a man of rank. And he is heading up an outpost in Nanking for the first time. And now he is faced with a difficult investigation where he has almost no clues, no theory as to what has happened to Meyer. As a result, he's resistant to taking this case. He feels as though it is going to be marked with failure, that his first major file straight out of the gate is going to be marked down as a failure.
And then, to make matters worse, we know in real life that Samuel Sokoban was a Russian Jewish parentage. Then, as he's getting ready to leave, now he's going to look for Myers to begin with. Then somehow there's a note that says, "Oh, by the way, he may be Jewish." Again, where does that come from? And if you made it up, that's spectacular because it really, really, really affected Sokoban.
I did not make that up. That was, in fact, true. And I am not sure if somebody just assumed because of Meyer's last name, but Sokoban was directed that Meyer might be Jewish, in which case, right, Sokoban himself, this is a game changer. What are the chances, right, of deep into the Chinese rural interior, you have one Jew looking for another? And with time ticking and wanting to be respectful of Jewish burial traditions, it's already the time is lapsing. So this adds additional pressure onto Sokoban. And here I would say is that the way that Sokoban is portrayed, and this may have nothing to do with the real Samuel Sokoban, but I made the choice to make him a lapsed Jew, highly secularized, and one who had made those choices in order to be able to fit in with a highly waspy, highly conventional culture that at that time would have been overtly anti Semitic. So, this is a professional, strategic, social choice that Sokoban has made. But in the meantime, he has grown very distant from his own faith. Getting this note that Meyer may, in fact, be Jewish only creates a deeper sense of stakes for Sokoban, more pressure, And then in addition to that, creates an additional parallel to Sokoban's younger brother, Ethan, who is also now missing in action, also an adventurous type, bold, very much like Meyer. And so, of course, Sokoban is thinking about his own brother, what has happened to him, if he is alive, if he is dead, if he will ever be buried, etc.
Yeah. Wow. And one of my next questions is a rather convoluted way of getting around it, but you know, it's 1918, and even though we had two opium wars, the last one being I think 1853, China has not really opened up to this idea of wanting Americans and British and foreigners on their soil. They really, really didn't care for us too much. They
Can you
tolerated it.
blame them?
Exactly.
I
But
wouldn't want someone else invading my country either.
exactly. So you see, then that leads me to this whole question of, because coming back, Sokoban starts to wonder the futility of what am I doing in China and what are we doing here in China when it's obvious, the two aren't measuring too much. Where did you get that from? That was wonderful.
That's a great question, Blaine. I think China is so vast. And at that moment, when that thought comes up for Sokoban, it's at a tough juncture in the investigation, in his own personal thoughts. And so it just felt like the right moment when he would question his purpose, his utility in China and his mission.
Wow. Well, I tell you what, it was perfect. I thought it was absolutely perfect the way it was done. Now, uh, overall, how many years was Samuel Jacoban in China?
That's a really good question. I don't know, but it certainly would have been at least a couple. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
and in my fictionalized version of that, I may have put him in China longer than he was, but I can't say with any authority.
You know, I don't want to give away anything of the book, but as I was thinking about this, what goes up must come down. And what went up the Yangtze River was one Samuel Jacoban. What comes down the Yangtze River is a completely different person.
Yes.
And I don't know if that was what you had in mind, but that's what I was seeing, that this person changed drastically as he was coming down river.
Yeah, we hope that our characters meet with certain events. These events test them, sometimes to the breaking point, emotionally or physically. And then we look at the cause and the effect. If we don't write characters who change, right, the reader wonders what they're reading for. It's part and parcel of the development of a book. So Sokoban would have to be changed by the events that he encounters upriver. The physical events, the toughness of them, the challenges. And then I think also by his relationship with his friend Chase that gets tested, Arthur Chase, who represents money and privilege and who is Sokoban's former college friend, also now in China and working for Standard Oil, which, by the way, is also borrowed from the original report. Sokoban stayed with a Standard Oil executive. And he's also changed by his relationship with Mr. Lin.
Yep. Yep. Lynn really changes him. Absolutely. I thought he and Lynn become, I don't want to say totally friends, but they certainly become friendly the longer they're together. And
They
he
become
realizes,
close.
yeah,
They
and
become
he
close.
realizes he
That's for
can't solve this mystery. He cannot solve the mystery of Meyer as well as some of his own personal issues unless Lynn is there with him. Wonderful.
He does, as you mentioned earlier, Blaine, that in the beginning of this book, Sokoban is very emotionally cut off. He is solitary. He's having a hard time, largely because of the MIA, the unknown, the uncertainty surrounding his younger brother. he has gone into a private grief that really has no name, because his brother is neither officially alive nor dead, but missing. And this really claws on Sokovin's mind. He cannot have this leave his head. And as a result, he really retreats inwardly. He's having a hard time coping. And Lynn is absolutely critical for being patient, understanding this, and then also being able to, I think, coax in many ways through his understanding and his very different worldview, his very different outlook that needs to be brought into this book. It was important to me to have a more Chinese Eastern outlook be represented and not be seen as something that was merely exotic or other, but as legitimate, as important, as useful as any kind of Western outlook. I hope that that is something that readers will take away from it. And it was important that Mr. Lin come to embody it. In many ways, it is the thing that helps to save Samuel Sokovin.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, now, one of the things that you discuss later on in the book is something called ambiguous loss.
Yes.
Th- What is meant by ambiguous loss? And can I assume that the two of them has sort of gotten over their own ambiguous losses somewhat?
Well, you'd have to read the book to kind of see where our characters end up on that. But that is the challenge. And it was tough for me to name when I was writing this book. But another way to think of ambiguous loss, which is a term that is now used in psychology circles, but would not have been at the time, not in Sokovin's era. It's a much more modern a thought. It always has existed, of course, but it's just been named now. And what ambiguous loss signals is when we do not have closure, when there is no neat resolution. So for me in writing this book, I kept thinking, what is it? Trying to articulate what is at the core of this? What is driving this? What is the theme that I keep coming back to again and again? What is it really that Samuel Sokovin is struggling with? Because we have the mystery of Meyer, and that's one thing that he is dealing with plot wise, and he absolutely does throughout the course of the book. But internally, what is it that this external mystery of Meyer is setting off within Sokovin, which is this other mystery, this other pain surrounding his brother and its loss? I would say this is probably the most painful thing that Sokovin is dealing with internally. In both cases, with Meyer's mystery and then also with his brother, it is a case of ambiguous loss.
Yeah.
So you could formulate this as a question, which was one that I continue to ask myself in writing this book is how do we go on? What do we do? How do we move forward when the questions that we most need answered don't seem to have any answers, right? When mystery continues to shroud, when we look for solutions and there are none, this is something that existed throughout human history. And it is something that modern readers, I hope, will identify, even though this story is set in a different country, in a different era,
Mhm.
even though modern readers may not look anything like Samuel Sokovin or Meyer or Mr. Lin. There isn't a human being alive, if you live long enough, who has not dealt with something to which there does not seem to be the answers that we crave. And so, because this is part of the human condition, it just felt true to me and universal. Ultimately, when I heard that term, which was during an NPR radio interview, very beholden to both Netflix and NPR for this novel. I was largely, I was really far through this manuscript and struggling to come up with the language for what it was that I was going after, which a hard to solve mystery didn't quite capture it.
Mhm.
And I heard the interview on my car radio, and I just pulled over to the side of the road and listened to the full interview, and I said, "This is it. Ambiguous loss. This is what I have been trying, right, to explore in this book."
Well, I think you did a fine job with it. By the way, historical fiction. Any favorite historical fiction authors or writers that you read when you were growing up?
Well, I mean, I would say I was already all grown up, when that was happening, but, there's a couple of titles I will say, not necessarily historical fiction, that influenced this, one of which is Marguerite Duras' The Lover. Another is, Empire of the Sun, J.G. Ballard. And then more, perhaps books that I have read in the last few decades. The short story writer Sam Shepard is fantastic, and Andrea Barrett were definitely influences. They have done such tremendous, tremendous work in immersing readers in their worlds that I was just
Yeah.
quite inspiring.
Wonderful. Great. All right. Well, now what's next? What's coming up next for Allison Alsup? We having another book? We going on a book tour? What are we doing?
Well, I have a few more book events. So I'll be going to the Mississippi Book Festival, the Louisiana Book Festival. I'll be doing an event up at Martha's Vineyard, all of that this fall. And I hope in the spring to be doing a couple of literary festivals here in New Orleans. I'm excited that an audiobook is in production. So that'll be coming out. I don't have details. I just found this out, but it'll be coming out at the end of October. I'm really excited to hear my book, right, read by someone else and their interpretation, what they will bring to the page. I'm currently at work on novel number 2. It will also be, I think, technically historical. Um, this is a little painful because now I will have lived through a time I'm considered historical, I think, at this point, like maybe we can call ourselves vintage here, Blaine, but like
Yeah,
we're
I
now
am.
historical. So this one, this book is going to be set for the most part in the 80s in an undisclosed Eastern European country during a
Oh,
Cold War like event. So will not be based on any one particular country. In other words, I will not be trying to reproduce Poland or Hungary or the Czech Republic, but it will be following, like Samuel Sokovin, a fairly high ranking guy who works for the government as a lawyer. So sometimes he's good, sometimes he's not. And it will be following him and his family, their trials. And again, trauma will enter into it.
having a wife who grew up in communist Romania, I'm looking forward to that. I know my wife will be too. And I know that no matter what you try, she'll relate that somehow to Romania. And she escaped in
That's my hope.
1984. So yeah,
That is
so
my
that's
hope. My hope is that this will pass muster with those, and it will not be necessarily a one-on-one translation. 100% of the details will not necessarily ring true to them, but I hope the spirit and enough of it will ring true that readers from Eastern Europe will identify with the book. And then I'm also hoping that for those of us who grew up, here in the United States during the 80s, the 60s, 70s, or 80s, really the Cold War was so impressed upon us.
mhm,
It was this other world, that was always a factor, this kind of shadow world. So that's how my interest in that, came
mhm,
about.
yeah. I remember sitting with a gentleman somewhere in the middle of God knows where, Romania. And I said to him, "Did you ever think you'd be sitting here 2015, 2016, whatever year it was, having coffee with an American?" He says, never came to him, never thought of that, never thought that the two worldviews would eventually come together. And, interesting. So I'm looking forward to that one. Wow. Okay. Send me an advance copy. I'll want to read that one. Okay.
Happily,
Oh,
happily.
all right, friends. With that, I don't want to take up Allison's time anymore. She's been very gracious with us today. And I want to say, Allison, thank you so much for being with us today on Books and Looks.
Lane, it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you. I appreciate your audience for being readers, for being curious readers and wanting to know the story behind the story.
Well, thank you again, Allison. Really, really enjoyed this book. I think you're going to I think you're going to want to go out and get this book. I said, this is one of those books that just will last with you. It is a wonderful book. And again, she even writes about Chesterfield cigarettes. Who would have thought that in a book nowadays? Ay, ay, ay. But it all ties in. Everything ties in. Ambiguous loss, Meyer, Sokovin. It's a great book. Really was a great book and fun interview with Allison. Hey, next week, what's coming up? Coming up is an author named Janet Sherland, who's writing her book, Abandoned at Birth. And this is about a woman, Janet Sherland, who was adopted. And her goal is to try to find her birth mother. And this is really interesting, maybe a little controversial for some people, but you know what? It's her memoir, and God bless her. She felt like she wanted to do this, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with her. And that's next week here on Books and Looks. So, anyway, on behalf of my website, viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying, may all your leaves be pages in a book. So long.